Frank, a 72-year-old mechanic, faces eviction as his beloved garage of 43 years is slated for demolition to make way for a commercial center. A dismissive young official demands compliance, scattering Frank's cherished tools, some inherited from his father. As Frank quietly packs, memories of decades serving Milfield flood back. The next morning, chaos erupts. Luxury cars, Bentleys, Corvettes, Mustangs, line the street outside his worn-down shop. Who orchestrated this spectacle? Why now? The truth behind these gleaming machines and their drivers promises to unravel a tale of loyalty, gratitude, and a community's hidden heart. Love stories of justice and community spirit? Subscribe to Incredible Stories. Join us to uncover tales like Frank's, where kindness and memory shine. Your support keeps these narratives alive. Hit subscribe, share, and comment to stand with us in celebrating unsung heroes. Let's keep history's heart beating. The old garage, with its sagging tin roof and cracked concrete floor, was slated for demolition in just a few days. Frank Donovan, a 72-year-old mechanic with hands as weathered as the shop itself, stood inside, surrounded by the ghosts of a lifetime's work. For 43 years, this small, unassuming corner of the town had been his kingdom, a place where engines roared back to life and families drove away with renewed hope. The walls, peeling and faded, were a gallery of memories. Yellowed photographs of grinning customers posing beside their freshly repaired cars, handwritten thank you notes taped haphazardly among the clutter, and the original wrenches and screwdrivers his father had used when he opened the shop in 1963. Every oil stain on the floor told a story: a late-night repair for a stranded mother, a rebuilt transmission for a teenager's first car, a patched-up truck that carried a family through hard times. To Frank, this wasn't just a garage, it was a living record of his life's purpose. On a quiet Tuesday morning, as Frank knelt beside Mrs. Wilson's 1989 Buick, swapping out spark plugs with the precision of a surgeon, a letter arrived that shattered his world. He'd maintained that Buick since the day Mrs. Wilson drove it off the lot, her late husband beaming with pride. Now, as Frank wiped his hands on a rag and unfolded the official notice, his heart sank. The city council had approved a rezoning plan. His block, they declared, would be transformed into a gleaming commercial hub filled with boutique shops and trendy restaurants. The garage, deemed structurally unsound, was to be razed. Frank had 7 days to pack up and leave. No relocation assistance, no compensation. Just a cold, single sheet of paper dismissing nearly half a century of sweat and sacrifice. He stood frozen, the notice trembling in his calloused hands, as a wave of disbelief washed over him. How could they erase everything he'd built? How could they reduce his life's work to a footnote in their grand plans? Frank barely slept that night. He sat in the dark, staring at the toolbox his father had passed down to him, its chipped red paint a reminder of the legacy he'd vowed to carry on. His mind churned with memories of long days spent teaching his son how to change oil, of customers who'd become friends, of the pride he felt every time he handed back a set of keys. But beneath the nostalgia was a gnawing fear. What would he do without this place? At 72, he wasn't ready to fade away, to become just another old man with nothing left to give. Yet the city's decision felt like a death sentence, not just for the garage, but for the part of him that still burned with purpose. The next day, a young official in a crisp suit appeared at the garage's open door. He couldn't have been older than 30, his face smooth and unlined, his eyes glued to the tablet he clutched like a shield. He tapped the screen with an impatient rhythm, barely glancing at Frank, who was meticulously tightening a bolt on a customer's sedan. "Mr. Donovan," the official said, his voice clipped and professional, "I need your signature to confirm you've received the eviction notice." Frank paused, his wrench still in hand, and looked up. The young man's tone carried no malice, but it was laced with the arrogance of someone who saw Frank as an obstacle, a relic standing in the way of progress. To him, this garage was just a crumbling eyesore, not the heartbeat of a community. Frank's chest tightened with a mix of anger and sorrow, but he said nothing. He set the wrench down slowly, his movements deliberate, as if each gesture was a quiet act of defiance. The official, growing restless, stepped forward and snatched Frank's toolbox from the workbench, assuming it would spur the old man to comply. "Why are you still hanging on?" the official asked, his voice edged with exasperation. "This place is coming down whether you like it or not." The words cut deep, but Frank's face remained stoic. He knelt beside the toolbox, now spilled open on the floor, and began picking up each tool one by one. A hammer, a socket wrench, a screwdriver worn smooth from decades of use. His hands moved with reverence, as if he were gathering the pieces of his own soul. Each tool carried a memory: the hammer his father used to tap out dents, the wrench he'd gripped during countless late-night repairs, the screwdriver he'd lent to a neighbor in need. As he collected them, Frank's mind raced with a quiet resolve. He wouldn't let them take this from him. Not without a fight. The official watched, his impatience giving way to unease. There was something unnerving about Frank's silence. The way his eyes seemed to see through the present into a past the young man couldn't comprehend. With a huff, the official left, assuming his job was done. But Frank knew this was only the beginning. He spent the rest of the day in the garage, surrounded by the familiar hum of machinery and the faint scent of motor oil, steeling himself for whatever came next. He didn't know how he'd save his shop, but he felt the weight of every family he'd helped, every car he'd fixed, every moment that had made this place more than just a building. He wasn't ready to let go. The following morning, the quiet street outside the garage erupted into chaos. A line of cars stretched down the block, their engines gleaming under the early sun. There were Bentleys with polished chrome, Corvettes that purred with power, and vintage Mustangs lovingly restored to their former glory. Dozens of vehicles, each one a testament to Frank's skill, filled the street in a spontaneous parade of loyalty. Their owners, men and women of all ages, from lifelong locals to out-of-towners who'd heard of Frank's magic touch, stood beside their cars, their faces alight with determination. They'd come to show the world what this garage meant, to prove that Frank's work wasn't just a job, but a lifeline for their community. Frank stepped outside, his eyes widening at the sight. His heart swelled with a mix of pride and gratitude, emotions he hadn't let himself feel in years. These weren't just customers. They were people whose lives he'd touched, whose stories he'd helped write. Mrs. Wilson, now frail but fierce, stood by her Buick, her hands clasped as she nodded at Frank with quiet resolve. A young man in a leather jacket leaned against his Corvette, the same car Frank had rebuilt after a wreck that nearly cost him everything. A family of four stood beside their minivan, the one Frank had kept running through years of financial hardship. Each person carried a story, and each story led back to the garage. As the crowd grew, whispers spread through the town. Reporters arrived, their cameras flashing, drawn by the spectacle of luxury cars parked outside a rundown shop. Neighbors gathered, murmuring about the injustice of the city's plan. Frank stood at the center of it all, his weathered face softening as he realized he wasn't alone. For the first time since the notice arrived, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the garage could be saved. Not because of its walls or its roof, but because of the people who believed in what it stood for. The young official, alerted by the commotion, returned to the scene. His tablet was still in hand, but his confidence had faltered. He surveyed the crowd, his eyes darting from the boss to the faces, and for the first time he seemed to grasp the weight of what he'd dismissed. Frank met his gaze, not with anger, but with quiet dignity. In that moment, the old mechanic wasn't just fighting for his shop. He was fighting for every small, overlooked place that held a community together. The official turned away, his steps uncertain, as the crowd's murmurs grew louder, their voices rising in defense of the man who'd given them so much. The garage, for now, still stood. And as Frank looked out at the sea of cars and faces, he knew this was only the beginning of the battle. His heart, heavy with the weight of the past, now burned with a fierce determination to protect his legacy, not for himself, but for the town that had made him who he was. Frank stood behind the counter of his garage, wiping his grease-stained hands on a worn rag, the faint scent of motor oil clinging to his skin like a second shadow. He didn't look up when the man in the crisp suit entered, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the concrete floor. The stranger, who didn't bother with introductions, carried an air of authority that seemed to fill the small, cluttered space. His eyes swept over the garage with a sneer, taking in the shelves lined with tools, the stacks of tires, and the faint hum of a radio in the corner playing an old country tune. "I need to talk to someone about an extension," the man said, his tone clipped, impatient. "These parts orders take weeks to arrive. You know, this place." He paused, his gaze narrowing with disdain. "It's done for." Frank's chest tightened, but he kept his face steady, his calloused fingers still working the rag. He'd heard whispers of change coming to Milfield, but this was the first time it had walked through his door. The man's words hung heavy in the air, each one landing like a blow. "How much longer do you think you can keep this up?" the official continued, his voice dripping with condescension. He waved a hand dismissively toward Frank's workbench, a sacred space where every wrench, socket, and screwdriver was arranged with the precision of a surgeon's tray. "Modern cars need computers, not, whatever this is." The gesture was vague, but it cut deep, dismissing decades of sweat, skill, and pride in a single flick of the wrist. Frank opened his mouth to respond, to defend the life he'd built within these walls. But the words caught in his throat. His hesitation seemed to irritate the official, who slammed his hand down on the counter with a force that rattled the room. A tray of tools, each one meticulously placed, some handed down from Frank's father, toppled to the floor. The clatter of wrenches, sockets, and screwdrivers echoed like a small explosion, each piece hitting the concrete with a sound that felt personal, like a betrayal. Frank's heart sank as he watched a socket wrench, a gift from his father on his 16th birthday, skitter across the floor. That wrench had been a symbol of trust, of a legacy passed down through calloused hands, and now it lay scattered among the chaos. Slowly, painfully, Frank knelt to the ground. His arthritic knees groaned in protest, each movement a reminder of the years he'd spent bending over engines, coaxing life back into machines others had given up on. His weathered hands trembled as he reached for the wrench, its familiar weight grounding him even as his mind swirled with a storm of emotions, anger, grief, and a quiet, stubborn resolve. He picked up each tool with care, as if gathering pieces of his own heart, his fingers brushing against the cool metal with a tenderness that belied his rough exterior. Outside, pedestrians passed by the garage's open door, their eyes flicking toward the scene before quickly looking away. They hurried on, unwilling to linger on the sight of a man collecting the fragments of his life's work, as if his struggle was something contagious. That evening, long after the official had left and the garage had emptied, Frank sat alone on his old wooden stool. The air was still, the only sound the faint creak of the stool beneath him. His palm rested on the battered toolbox his father had left him, its surface worn smooth by years of use. He stared into the empty space of the garage, but his eyes saw beyond the present, beyond the flickering fluorescent lights and the oil-stained floor. In his mind's eye, he saw the countless cars that had rolled through these doors over the decades, each one a story, a problem solved, a life made easier. He remembered the rumble of engines, the laughter of customers, the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. This garage wasn't just a building. It was a tapestry of memories, woven from thousands of moments that had defined his existence. By the next morning, word of the garage's fate had spread through Milfield like wildfire. The small town, nestled in its quiet routines, buzzed with the news, though most reactions were muted. "Change is inevitable," people said over coffee at the diner, their voices tinged with resignation. "That's progress." Across the street at the coffee shop, conversations hummed with a different energy. A real estate agent, her eyes bright with ambition, leaned forward in her booth, gesturing animatedly. "This new development will boost property values," she declared, her voice carrying across the room. That old garage was becoming an eyesore anyway. Her words stung, though Frank wasn't there to hear them. No one seemed to recall the blizzard of '96 when Frank had kept the garage open through howling winds and knee-deep snow, fixing tire chains and jump-starting batteries for stranded neighbors. Nor did they mention how he'd never raised his prices, not even for the retirees who came to him with their aging sedans, trusting him to keep them on the road. In the quiet of his garage, Frank felt the weight of those forgotten moments. He wasn't just losing a business, he was losing a piece of himself. A connection to his father, to the town, to the life he'd poured his soul into. The official's words echoed in his mind. "How much longer do you think you can compete?" And for the first time, Frank felt the full force of that question. Not because he doubted his skill, but because he saw the world shifting around him, moving faster than his hands could keep up. Yet, as he sat there, his fingers tracing the edges of the toolbox, a flicker of defiance stirred within him. This place, these tools, these memories, they were his. And no matter what came next, they always would be. James Parker, the proud owner of Sleek Auto Service Center, a modern facility that had sprung up along the highway just a year ago, stopped by Frank's garage with a mix of pity and pragmatism in his eyes. He leaned casually against the weathered doorframe, his crisp, spotless uniform a stark contrast to the grease-stained walls of Frank's shop. "The future's all about computerized diagnostics, Frank," he said, his voice carrying the weight of inevitability. "You've been clinging to nostalgia, my friend. There aren't even many classic cars left to tinker with anymore." His words hung in the air, not cruel but blunt, like a man delivering a diagnosis he knew the patient didn't want to hear. James's gaze softened for a moment, betraying a flicker of respect for the older mechanic, but he didn't press further. He'd said his piece. Frank didn't bother to argue. What was there to say? The world had moved on, and he hadn't. Instead, he turned back to his work, his hands moving with the deliberate care of a man who'd spent a lifetime mastering his craft. He packed away his tools, each one a relic of a bygone era, wrenches, screwdrivers, pliers, wrapping them gently in soft cloths as though tucking in cherished friends for a long, uncertain journey. The oil filters and spare parts followed, each item carefully placed in boxes, their metallic clinks echoing faintly in the quiet garage. Every motion was methodical, almost reverent, but beneath the surface, a quiet ache pulsed in Frank's chest. This wasn't just packing, it was a farewell to a life's work, to a legacy he'd built with his own hands. That afternoon, Bill Henderson, an old high school friend, shuffled into the garage, his boots scuffing against the concrete floor. The two men had played football together 55 years ago, their youth a distant memory of sweat-soaked fields and carefree laughter. Now, Bill stood awkwardly, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets, his eyes avoiding Frank's. Came to see if you'd sell me your sign," he mumbled, his voice thick with unease. "Thought I might hang it in my den, for old time's sake." The request was simple, but it carried a weight that neither man could ignore. Bill wasn't just asking for a piece of metal, he was asking for a fragment of their shared past, a memento of a place that had meant something to both of them. Frank's throat tightened, a lump forming that made words impossible. He nodded silently, his jaw clenched, and turned away to hide the sting in his eyes. The sign, bold, hand-painted, a beacon for decades, felt like the last piece of himself he could give away. As the sun dipped low, painting the garage floor with long golden shadows, Frank stood alone in the quiet space that had been his sanctuary for so long. He pulled open an old, creaky drawer in his desk, the wood groaning under years of use. Inside lay a treasure trove of memories, faded Polaroid photographs, their edges curled from time, capturing generations of customers. There were snapshots of wide-eyed children perched on the hoods of their parents' cars, grinning as Frank handed them a wrench to help with an oil change. There were families he'd served through life's milestones, divorces that left cars traded or sold, graduations marked by shiny new vehicles, funerals where he'd quietly ensured a grieving widow's car was roadworthy. Each photo was a story, a thread in the tapestry of Frank's life. His fingers lingered on the images, his heart swelling with pride and sorrow in equal measure. These people had trusted him, relied on him, and now he wondered if they'd even notice he was gone. Frank reached for a small notepad, its pages yellowed but crisp. With his careful, slanting handwriting, he poured out a simple truth. "Thank you. I've lived a life without regrets." The words were understated, but they carried the weight of a man who'd given everything to his work and his community. He taped the note to the inside of the shop's window, positioning it so only someone pausing to look closely would see it. It wasn't for show. It was a quiet confession, a final message to a world that might not care but had shaped him all the same. That night in the small apartment above the garage, the only home he'd known since his wife's passing years ago, Frank sat on the edge of his bed. The room was sparse, filled with the faint hum of solitude. His fingers traced the worn initials his father had carved into the old toolbox at his side, the wood smooth from decades of touch. Those initials were a link to a time when his father had taught him the trade, when the world seemed simpler, and a good mechanic was a hero in a small town. Frank's voice broke the silence, a hoarse whisper that barely reached the walls. "I just hope someone remembers that these hands once helped them get back on the road." The words dissolved into the stillness, unanswered except by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional blare of a horn. Outside, people hurried home, their lives racing forward, oblivious to the quiet man whose world had just closed its doors. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Frank pulled into the lot of his garage for the last time. At 40, he was a man whose calloused hands told stories of decades spent coaxing life back into broken engines. The golden light of dawn bathed the weathered building, its chipped paint and oil-stained floors a testament to a lifetime of labor and love. This place wasn't just a business. It was his sanctuary, his legacy, his heart. But now, because of a single official document, a bureaucratic oversight that felt like a betrayal, it was all slipping away. As he rolled up the heavy garage door, the familiar creak sounded like a funeral dirge. His chest tightened with a mix of grief and resignation. Each step inside stirring memories of late nights, laughter, and the satisfaction of a job well done. He began sorting through his tools. Each wrench and socket a piece of himself he was forced to pack away. Then a low, unmistakable rumble shattered the quiet. A V8 engine, throaty and alive, growled in the distance. Frank froze, his hand gripping a worn screwdriver. Another engine joined the chorus, then another, until the air vibrated with a mechanical symphony. He stepped outside, squinting into the sunlight, and what he saw stole his breath. A cherry-red 1967 Corvette Stingray rolled to a stop in front of the garage, its curves gleaming like a polished jewel. Behind it, a midnight blue Mustang GT purred with restrained power. A Bentley Continental followed, its elegance almost absurd in the modest neighborhood. Then came a vintage Jaguar E-Type, its sleek lines evoking a bygone era of craftsmanship. One after another, luxury and classic cars lined the narrow street, their engines humming in perfect harmony. It was as if a dream had materialized, unbidden and surreal. Neighbors spilled out of their homes, bleary-eyed and bewildered. Smartphones appeared, capturing the impossible scene as the procession grew. Traffic ground to a halt, drivers craning their necks to witness what looked like an impromptu car show conjured from thin air. Frank stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing to make sense of it. His heart pounded, a mix of confusion and a faint, fragile hope he didn't dare name. The Corvette's door swung open, and a man stepped out, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the grease-stained coveralls Frank wore. Tyler Johnson, now 42, was unrecognizable as the gangly teenager Frank had known. As the CEO of a tech empire in Boston, Tyler carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had conquered the world. But Frank saw it instantly. The same earnest eyes, the same kid who'd shown up 24 years ago with a broken-down Honda and a desperate plea. Tyler's polished shoes crunched on the gravel as he approached. The street fell silent, the engine's hum fading to a reverent murmur. Frank's throat tightened as Tyler stopped before him, his expression unreadable. Then, in a gesture that seemed to stop time itself, Tyler dropped to one knee. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a faded photograph, its edges worn from years of being carried. The image showed a younger Tyler, all nervous smiles, standing beside Frank in front of that same Honda, its hood propped open like a patient on an operating table. Tyler's voice, steady but thick with emotion, carried across the hushed crowd. "If it weren't for you, Frank, I wouldn't be here today." His words hung in the air, heavy with gratitude. "You fixed my car when I had nothing, refused payment when looked I couldn't afford it. You told me to pay you back when I got my first paycheck. That job, that moment, changed everything for me." Frank's eyes burned, his vision blurring as memories flooded back. He remembered that day vividly. Tyler's panic, the way his hands shook as he explained he needed the car to make it to a job interview that could alter his future. Frank had seen something in the kid, a spark, a determination, and he'd worked through the night to get that Honda running. When Tyler tried to pay with the little he had, Frank waved it off, saying, "Get the job first, then we'll talk." He hadn't thought much of it at the time. It was just what he did. But now, standing before this man whose life had been transformed, Frank felt the weight of that small act ripple through time. One by one, the other drivers stepped forward, their faces a gallery of stories Frank had touched. Each car, each person, represented a moment when Frank's kindness, his skill, his belief in second chances had made a difference. The Mustang's driver, a woman in her 30s, clutched a keychain Frank had given her when he repaired her first car, a beat-up sedan she'd driven to college. The Bentley's owner, an older man with silver hair, spoke of a late-night tow Frank had offered when no one else would stop. The Jaguar's driver, a young artist, held up a sketch of the garage she'd drawn as a thank you years ago. Each story wove a tapestry of connection, of a man who'd given more than he'd ever taken. Frank's knees trembled as he listened, overwhelmed by the outpouring. He'd never seen his work this way, not as a series of tours, but as a chain of lives intertwined with his own. The grief that had clung to him since losing the garage began to loosen, replaced by a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Tyler rose to his feet, placing a hand on Frank's shoulder. "This isn't the end, Frank," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "You've built something bigger than this garage. You've built us." The crowd erupted in applause, neighbors and strangers alike moved by the scene. Frank wiped his eyes, unable to speak, his heart too full to find words. The car's engines roared to life again, a triumphant chorus that seemed to echo Tyler's promise. As the sun climbed higher, bathing the street in light, Frank stood amid the people he'd unknowingly shaped, feeling for the first time in days that maybe his time hadn't run out after all. The morning sun spilled across the cracked asphalt of Frank's garage, casting long shadows that stretched like memories over the rows of polished cars. A crowd had gathered, their voices a low hum of anticipation, swelling with each new arrival. Among them stood Sarah Chen, her trauma surgeon's scrubs traded for a simple blouse, her hands clasped tightly as if to steady the emotions swirling within her. Years ago, in the dead of night, Frank had found her stranded on the side of a rain-slicked road, her car's tire blown out and her dreams teetering on the edge. She'd been a bundle of nerves, one day away from her medical school entrance exam, her future hinging on making it to the testing center on time. Frank hadn't asked questions. He'd knelt in the mud, tools clinking softly, and fixed her tire without a word about payment. Now, standing before him, Sarah felt the weight of that moment, a stranger's kindness that had ripple effects she could scarcely quantify. Because of Frank, she'd arrived at the exam with minutes to spare. Because of him, she'd walked the halls of hospitals, saving lives, her hands steady where others faltered. Her eyes, glistening with gratitude, lingered on Frank, who stood unassuming in his grease-stained overalls, unaware of the lives he'd shaped. Marcus Williams, now a judge whose presence commanded respect, adjusted his tie and surveyed the crowd with a quiet intensity. His tailored suit gleamed under the sunlight, a far cry from the threadbare clothes he'd worn years ago when he'd first met Frank. Back then, Marcus had been just another kid from the neighborhood, scraping by, his ambitions for law school little more than a flicker in his mind. Frank had never judged him, never treated him as less. Instead, he'd offered a steady hand, literally and figuratively, teaching Marcus how to fix a carburetor, how to believe in the value of honest work. Today, Marcus stood not to settle a debt, but to defend something larger. The soul of this community, embodied in Frank's garage. His deep voice carried a quiet resolve as he addressed the crowd, his words less about Frank's individual acts and more about the ethos he represented, a beacon of integrity in a world that too often prized profit over people. Marcus's chest tightened with pride, but also with fear. If the razoning went through, this place, this haven, could be reduced to rubble, and with it a piece of the neighborhood's heart. The crowd grew denser, a tapestry of faces young and old, their phones raised to capture the moment. Hashtags bloomed across social media. Frank's garage trending first locally, then regionally, as stories poured in from those who'd been touched by Frank's quiet generosity. Posts recounted late-night repairs, free oil changes for single mothers, lessons in mechanics for curious kids. The air buzzed with the energy of a community rallying, their voices amplified by the digital echo chamber. Among them, unnoticed at first, stood a young city official, his clipboard clutched tightly, his face a mask of uncertainty. He'd been the one to knock over Frank's tools weeks ago, a careless act during an inspection that had sparked this whole zoning dispute. Now he hovered at the crowd's edge, mouth slightly agape, as if realizing for the first time the weight of what he'd stumbled into. No one spared him a glance. His authority, so certain in the sterile halls of City Hall, felt small here, dwarfed by the collective will of a neighborhood united. His fingers twitched around the clipboard, his confidence unraveling like a frayed thread. Then, a sleek black Mercedes pulled up, its door opening with a quiet thud. Out stepped Thomas Grant, his silver hair catching the light, his impeccable suit a testament to the heights he'd climbed. As the director of the Department of Transportation, Thomas carried an air of quiet power, but his eyes softened as they landed on Frank. Decades ago, he'd been a broke college student, scraping by on instant noodles and hope. Frank had taken him under his wing, teaching him how to change his own oil, how to take pride in doing things right. Those lessons had stayed with Thomas, shaping his career, grounding him even as he rose through the ranks. Now standing before the crowd, he held an official document, its city seal gleaming like a promise. "Frank Donovan," he began, his voice formal but warm. "It is my honor to present you with this certificate of recognition for outstanding service." He handed the document to Frank, whose calloused hands trembled slightly as he accepted it. Thomas leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There might be a rezoning amendment discussed at tomorrow's emergency council meeting." The words hung in the air, a spark of hope in a battle not yet won. The crowd erupted, cheers echoing off the garage's weathered walls, a wave of sound that seemed to lift the morning light itself. Frank stood motionless, his eyes glistening, the certificate clutched tightly in his hands. The cars around him, each one a story, a life touched, gleamed in the sun, their polished surfaces reflecting a man who'd given more than he'd ever taken. He didn't speak. Words had never been his currency. Instead, he sank onto the garage steps, his fingers tracing the familiar weight of a wrench, polishing it with the same care he'd always shown his tools, his craft, his community. The act was meditative, a quiet defiance against the forces threatening to erase this place. His heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and disbelief, not for the certificate, but for the faces before him, the lives intertwined with his own. A small boy pushed through the crowd, his sneakers scuffing the pavement, a broken toy car clutched in his hands. His eyes, wide with the trust, met Frank's. "Can you fix this for me, sir?" he asked, his voice soft but clear. Frank looked down at the T, its wheels askew, its plastic frame cracked but not beyond repair. A smile broke across his face, weary but warm, as he nodded. "If you believe I can," he said, his voice steady despite the tears still shining in his eyes, "then I will." The boy's grin was a mirror of Frank's own, a spark of connection that said more than any certificate ever could. Around them, the crowd's cheers faded into a hum, the morning sun climbing higher, and Frank's garage stood firm, a testament to a man who'd spent a lifetime fixing more than just cars. In the weeks that followed, the community came together with a fierce, unspoken resolve, as if the very soul of their town had been stirred. Frank's garage, a humble cornerstone of their daily lives, became the rallying point for something greater than brick and mortar. It wasn't just about saving a building, it was about preserving the essence of a man who had poured his heart into every wrench turned, every engine revived. Frank, with his weathered hands and quiet pride, had always been more than a mechanic. To the townsfolk, he was a keeper of stories, a man whose steady presence reminded them of simpler times when hard work was its own reward. The thought of his garage shuddering under the cold hand of city bureaucracy sparked a fire in their hearts, a collective ache to hold on to something sacred. Frank himself stood at the heart of it all, his stoic exterior hiding a storm of emotions. He wasn't a man prone to sentimentality, but the idea of closing his garage, his life's work, on someone else's terms gnawed at him. Late at night, alone in the dim glow of his shop, he'd run his calloused fingers along the edges of his tools, each one carrying the weight of decades. He thought of his father, who'd taught him the trade, and the customers who'd become like family. The city's plans to rezone and redevelop felt like a betrayal, not just of him, but of the values he'd built his life around. Yet, as the community rallied, Frank felt a flicker of hope, a quiet pride that his small world had touched so many. He wasn't fighting for himself alone anymore. He was fighting for the legacy of every grease-stained hand that had ever fixed something broken. The townspeople, too, carried their own burdens and dreams into the fight. There was Maria, the single mother who ran the bakery down the street, who saw in Frank's struggle a mirror of her own. She'd spent years kneading dough before dawn, her hands aching but her heart full, knowing her pastries brought comfort to her neighbors. She joined the rallies, her voice trembling with passion, because she knew what it meant to pour your soul into a small business only to face the threat of losing it. Then there was young Tommy, barely out of high school, who'd spent his afternoons at Frank's garage, watching and learning. To him, Frank was a hero, a man who'd shown him that working with your hands could be a calling, not just a job. Tommy's quiet anger at the city's plans fueled his determination to speak up, his voice cracking but resolute at town hall meetings. In time, the community's efforts bore fruit, not in the way they'd first imagined, but in a way that felt right. Frank's garage did close, but it was on his terms, a quiet victory that carried the weight of dignity. He locked the doors for the last time with a steady hand, his heart heavy but at peace, knowing he'd fought the good fight. The town didn't let his legacy fade. At the corner where the garage once stood, they affixed a bronze plaque, its gleaming surface etched with words that spoke of permanence. Frank's Garage, never forgotten. It wasn't just a marker, it was a promise, a testament to a man who'd lived by his principles and left an indelible mark on the town's soul. Every time someone passed by, they'd pause, their thoughts drifting to Frank, to the hum of his tools, to the way he'd always greeted them with a numb and a knowing smile. The ripple effects of Frank's story spread far beyond the garage. The city council, moved by the community's passion, created an annual scholarship in Frank's name, a beacon for young people chasing vocational dreams. It wasn't just about money, it was about honoring the kind of work Frank stood for, the kind that built calluses and character in equal measure. Local schools, inspired by the movement, began inviting artisans, carpenters, welders, mechanics, to share their stories with students. These weren't just guest lectures, they were celebrations of the dignity found in crafting something with your own hands, in fixing what others deemed broken. The kids listened, wide-eyed, as these craftsmen spoke of pride, struggle, and the quiet joy of a job well done, and for some, it sparked a dream they hadn't known they could chase. Perhaps the most profound change was in how the townspeople began to see the world around them. The fight for Frank's Garage had opened their eyes to the quiet stories tucked behind every storefront. The bakery, where Maria still rose before dawn, wasn't just a place to buy bread. It was a sanctuary of warmth and resilience. The tailor shop, with its whirring sewing machine, became a testament to patience and precision. Even the shoe repair shop, often overlooked, held tales of care and restoration. People started to wonder about the lives behind those doors, the dreams and sacrifices woven into every stitch, every loaf, every polished heel. They began to linger a little longer, to ask questions, to listen. The town felt smaller, not in size but in the way hearts drew closer, bound by a newfound appreciation for the unsung heroes among them. Frank's story wasn't about fame or glory. He was the kind of man who didn't need his contributions shouted from rooftops. He only needed to live true to himself. His garage may have been taken, but his place in the town's heart was unshakable. His legacy lived in the scholarship that bore his name, in the stories told in classrooms, in the way people looked at their neighbors' work with fresh eyes. It's easy to let a story like this slip away, to forget the quiet heroes who shape a community. But if no one retells it, if no one carries it forward, the past fades into silence. Frank's Garage and all it stood for deserves to be remembered, not just for a day, but for as long as there are people willing to honor kindness, justice, and the beauty of a life well lived.